Today is the third day of this February 1985 7-day retreat. We will take up various questions which people have asked during meetings. None of these being personal questions, but questions which concern all of us, which concern the human mind. One person asked, and please, I did not ever tape questions, they may not be formulated the way they were asked. That is not important, the verbatim formulation, but to use them here to question together. One person asked, aren't there times when thought is really useful or indispensable in our daily life? We talk so much about the divisiveness of thought, or thought and images from which come separation and sorrow. But isn't thought also very useful in daily life? If this question comes to one has to observe and see for oneself the role that thought plays in daily life and in relationship. Right here, for instance, if all of us had not learned to some degree or another the English language, we could not talk with each other, understand each other. Vocabulary is stored in the brain, and without that stored vocabulary we could not even understand the words that are being said, or could not pick words to express what needs to be expressed. In running this retreat together, if we hadn't learned how to cook, how to clean, wash dishes, do the necessary administrative work involved in putting a retreat together, if that hadn't been learned, in which thought plays a large role, we couldn't have a retreat. Skills like cooking or engineering or nursing, doctoring, a large part of that is learned in school by accumulating knowledge, which one then uses in action. To build a bridge takes a tremendous amount of memory of other bridges having been built, what went wrong, new ideas based on old ideas. And sometimes I've talked to inventors or scientists. A new idea comes up which the person says don't know where it came from. The best that one can say is that at the time that an insight came, there was no holding on to old concepts. But in the field of technology, these new ideas immediately become formalized, and they become part of the knowledge on which to build. This is how technology works. This kind of thought is useful, helpful, if it doesn't gather up byproducts. Talking about the retreat again, into which a lot of thought goes, as it is prepared and as it is going on. If maybe in walking around during the walking period, one thinks, I'm really getting pretty good at this, there is a thought which is not helpful. Isolates oneself from the rest of the people. Maybe not necessarily from the rest of this group, but of the people one thinks on the quote-unquote outside world. One is doing spiritual practice here, and that thought already gives a certain inspirational boost to the image, or creates an image. I am a spiritual person. That thought isolates and catches the mind, so that one is not aware of the footsteps touching the ground, the body moving, whatever there is to be aware of when a human being is walking. Or if in sitting, and maybe there are some moments where there's no thought in the mind, and then thought captures that instant and says, I'm making progress, I'm probably doing better than the person next to me. Or the person next to me seems to be so much more into it than I am. You may think these are silly examples, but this is what goes on in the mind if one is honest. And this kind of thought is divisive. May lead to ambition, wanting to be as good as the other or surpass the other, which breeds, as all comparison and competition does, a recklessness and callousness in the human mind, in which one does not mind pushing someone else out of the way, hurting them. One saw it at one instant during the Olympic Games where runners did not mind kicking each other in the shin in order to get to first place. With this kind of thought, comparative thought, competitive thought, needing to become somebody superior, whether it is economically, socially, politically, or spiritually, it's all the same ambition, the same goal of becoming someone. With this kind of thought, genuine human relationship, being in touch with each other without image, without ambition or comparison, is not possible. And then one wonders why things are awry in human relationship. One gives no attention to the effect and consequences of competitive, comparative thought. What it does to the human being and to human relationship. Man and woman in competition with each other. Who dominates whom? Who controls whom? So it's never been said, don't think or thought is bad, but let one be clear about what is thought and what are its reactions and its consequences, its effects on the whole body and on the body of relationship. One person said, taking off from what you said about goals in one of the talks, I was really wondering whether I have goals in coming here. And if I do not, why am I here? It's a question we all can ask ourselves. Maybe when it gets boring, nothing to do, for the mind, rather than slipping into pleasurable or frightening fantasy, to ask, what is one here for? Without having a pat answer. Does one have a goal, an aim? Probably no one is here who hasn't read books, Zen books or other spiritual literature which describes enlightenment, maybe gives illustrative descriptions of enlightenment experiences, which always stop at a certain point when the experience is consummated by the experiencer. One never hears what happened a year later, 2 years later, 10 years later. Maybe sometimes one hears, well, I haven't read those books. I try to stay away from books that describe enlightenment experiences. It can be a tremendous inspiration to start doing this work, because one wants to have that. One wants to attain it, obtain it, own it, possess it, hoping or thinking or believing that this will be the end of all one's problems and miseries. One has maybe developed a real faith in liberation or enlightenment experience, satori, nirvana, moksha, different names and different traditions. And the whole system is go to get it. We've talked so much about it that maybe it isn't quite like that with anyone anymore. But unless light is shed on our not just conscious but also unconscious motives, that they come into awareness, one may find some of these desires are lodged very deeply. One has not dropped them. They still lurk there in the wings of the unconscious. And by striving for a goal out there meaning usually in the future, which is the product of thinking. We've gone through that yesterday or the day before, that it is thought that creates the idea of tomorrow or next life, or I just read someplace, thank goodness we have 100,000 lives to do this thing. I read that in a publication. This all created by thought, time. There's nothing real about it. The only real thing is what happens now, this instant. What happens tomorrow is thought. Do you see that? What happened yesterday is memory. And even what will happen tomorrow is based on yesterday's memory. What we heard, learned, experienced yesterday and project into what we call tomorrow or next lifetime. All a succession of thoughts coming out of what was laid down in the brain in the past. This one can observe for oneself very distinctly, very clearly, that this kind of time, which we can call psychological time, is created by thinking. Time by the clock, or digital or otherwise, we have to learn. And that again is useful thought. If we didn't have this, we would not be able to run this retreat together. It's a common convenience that all of us understand to read time and to follow it up to a point. A little bit later or earlier does not matter. But that time too is invented by the human mind. There's nothing absolute about it. The vast universe has no time. Even though the sun seems to rise in the morning, or rather the earth turning toward the sun in the morning and away from it at night, it has nothing to do with time. We just use that for convenience to establish some kind of a grid by which we can relate to each other, do business with each other. So, we started by having goals being a thought creation. One can have a goal in one's mind. We even put it this way: I have this goal in mind and I'm doing everything I can to reach that goal, which is not an undivided whole being here, but part of one's mental activity, and whatever entails physically is directed toward something that's not here, something that is imagined or projected. Again, something that is needed when one builds a house. We're building a retreat house right now. One has to have certain timelines which are never being held to anyways. They always prove to be not quite feasible. But roughly, there is a timeline, a projection into what this thing will be like, how much it will cost. That too never comes out quite as one has planned. This is again the technological part, where programming, planning, time projection has a value for the convenience of the people who are working together to bring this thing about. But to sit here this instant and keep in mind the goal of enlightenment or emancipation, freedom, and wanting that freedom is away from what is actually sitting here, namely a human being in bondage. Bondage of thoughts, of emotions, of unconscious or semi-conscious programs and conditionings that are running one automatically. We went into that in great detail yesterday or the day before. To really sit and be here and question what is it that sits here, what is going on, happening this instant. Any kind of division or diffusion toward a goal in the future cuts one up, splits one up. It diffuses the energy. Do you see that? That the goal of what I will be tomorrow or next year or sometime in the future distracts, maybe as an inspiration, but still distracts the energies from questioning what I am right now. And that is maybe what needs to be looked at, entered into with one's total being. And maybe all answers will come out of being here rather than thinking of there. The person kept on questioning, the one who asked about, do I have any goals? He said, what about this needing to change? I don't know whether this person brought it up or we got to it together, it doesn't matter. What about seeing the need to change? Isn't that also a projection, a goal, an idea? Is it? If one observes in all honesty, openness, frankness, in all vulnerability to the pain that such observing and questioning causes, how one lives, how futile most of one's pursuits have turned out to be, the difficulties in relationship or the absence of relationship, all the images one has that encrust oneself sort of in an enclosure, and all the images one has of others that prevent the softness and immediacy of relationship. Not only prevent that, but always stir up old hatreds, old vengeful ideas against that person for what he did 2 years ago or 10 years ago. When one goes a step beyond one's own personal life and watches around oneself either directly by traveling or through the news, what is going on in the world? Human beings chasing each other from country to country. Refugees almost everywhere. Women and children carrying a few little things and tracking from one country to what is called another country because of war, because of acquisitiveness, clash of ideologies, ancient vengefulness, or one country wanting to make its borders safe and trying to eliminate the people in the border areas. so one has more safety. What kind of life is that? And if one watches frankly and honestly how territorial one is oneself, how one resents someone invading one's pad, or losing what one has in one's pad to another area. How much it hurts, how attached one is to what is mine here, in my house, in my location, in my country. Don't want anybody else to have it. It's all open for observation. One's attachment to one's territory, which is already a thing that's happening with animals. It's been studied very carefully. How animals defend territories, one can't say like human beings. It is done much more intelligently. With this kind of intelligence that seems to pervade the universe, where human thought isn't meddling, which, if it is self-centered, is highly unintelligent, because it is self-centered, not global or universally oriented. Animals don't kill animals that invade the territory. They just chase them away, and the other animal gets the message very quickly, without often a scratch. And yet there is fierce territorialism, has survival value for the animals. But for human beings, it has the opposite. It has death value. We think we survive if our country defends its borders fiercely. But the result of it inevitably has been war and killing. So observing this in the outside, so-called outside world, and finding, often to one's surprise, that the same stuff really goes on a small level inside. One can only see this if one is really free to look. One has no prejudicial ideas about Homo sapiens. But one looks freely. Then one cannot help. The thought comes on its own. Can there be a change in this human being? Can there be a change from all the habitual ancient patterns of reacting to a freedom from habit, from automatism? If one immediately starts flipping in books and looking whether there can be something, one will establish a goal. Because one will always find someone promising something. Religions have promised things since human beings have created them. Because human beings have created religions in order to have a hope out of the sorrow of human life. Human imagination has created paradise and Buddha realms and whatever. The eternal hunting grounds that the Indians believed in. Early Germanic people believed in an everlasting feast of bouting, dying, and then being resurrected by the Valkyries and getting booze till one was out. And then the whole thing started over, but there was no end to it, and that was what one imagined as the summum bonum, the best that could happen to a warrior. Women didn't figure largely in that. Except as the resurrectors of the fallen heroes. So, if the question comes, can there be change? Can there be a free acting which is not tied to the past, tied to one's programs and conditionings, including ancient animal patterns? Is it possible for a human being to act with love and compassion and a non-mechanical, non-trained intelligence? Is that a goal or is that a question? I think one cannot avoid asking this question. Because one sees unless love and compassion and a non-programmed intelligence inform our actions, we won't be here much longer. Or, even if nuclear weapons don't go off, ever, which they may not, we don't know, war and acquisition and competition and rivalry and all the stuff will inevitably continue. Because all the things that have been tried to control oneself, to impose religious sanctions or moral sanctions, have never worked. They've also set people against themselves and against each other. One either manages to control oneself, help of a lot of discipline, then one wants to control others or want others to control themselves too. There's the dominance and power game that comes into being. Or in the course of a human being controlling himself or herself, all the beauty of sensitivity, of perceiving what is beautiful in life is also thwarted and killed off. Because one cannot control the senses partially. It always goes all the way. Becoming an arid desert in the process. So if the question comes up, let it come up, ask it, and then wonder and inquire and watch whether it is possible for that sense of me, of I will, I must, I mustn't, I shall, all of that stuff, whether that can be seen, first of all, detected, observed, and whether the observation of it is punitive, condemning, accepting, or totally free from all of those programs. Whether there can in fact be an awareness that is not part of our mental patterns. And whether in such awareness an image can melt, can totally lose its power over the human mind, is seen for what it is and dispelled in this energy of awareness. At which instant awareness is not partial, personal anymore, but whole, all embracing, non-dividing, and intelligent, because it is not self-seeking. Maybe one will find, this is put dualistically, there's no one to find it. But what may happen in such awareness that is non-divisive is that a love which one has never known wells up. The love one usually knows is, I want you to love me, and for that I'll love you back, or I love you, but I also hope you will love me back. All of our so-called love relationships are one of bargaining or having a deal. I don't try to be sarcastic about it. I'm trying to describe it. It's always wanting something in return for what I'm giving you. Because if that doesn't come, the love very quickly can turn into hatred or deep disappointment, which means it wasn't love in the first place. Or it withered. The person who was asking this question about goals also asked me, do you have goals in this work here? One learns so quickly that to have any goals is sort of already has its own doom in it. Why should one have any goals in working together? This working together is totally sufficient unto itself. It needs no goal. Either insight happens, understanding happens, or it doesn't happen. But if one works in order that insight may happen, already built into that expectation is either disappointment that it doesn't happen, or feeling rewarded if it does happen, and this has nothing to do with this work. It is a very petty, personal position, which is embedded in the human mind, wanting reward for one's work. But it is only when one doesn't love one's work as it is, does it with one's total being. Then there is no room for needing reward. What's going on, living, is its own fulfillment, if you want to use that word. Living undividedly in a relationship of care and affection. Does that need a goal or a reward? those are thoughts that are extra and cause us either temporary pleasure or temporary disappointment. We used to, those of us who belonged to other Zen centers, vow daily to save all sentient beings. I always felt very uncomfortable with that vow. Until I read in one sutra, which I used to read a lot from in the old Zen center days, the Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, that he questioned, who are all those sentient beings that I vow to deliver? And he proceeded to say, these are the jealous, the ambitious, the envious beings within my own mind. And that made sense. Can one deliver those? Meaning, he doesn't go into seeing them. He just asks, can they be all delivered? But how else can they be delivered other than seeing jealousy, seeing envy and greed as it happens now, seeing it all the way, seeing its effects on relationship, its consequences on oneself, its repetitiveness, seeing the ineffectualness of vows against it, or what is the other thing one does? Repenting. And just wondering, can all these beings be freed, be seen, and the seeing finishing it, being done with it. And if greed is not there in one human being, if violence is not there in one human being, that human being will not contribute to this vast stream of greed and violence that inundates all of us, permeates the human consciousness in which we partake, which manifests in us. The human consciousness which contains greed, ambition, violence, envy. And also occasionally a moment of goodness, tenderness and care. People often say, why don't you mention those? Often, if we probe into where the question comes from, is one wants to be consoled and comforted. And that doesn't lead to questioning and looking at what really hurts one deeply in one's relationship with other human beings. Goodness and affection hurts no one. It doesn't need to be pointed out, although pride in it needs to be pointed out. Because it can be very subtle to feel I am an altruistic person, much more so than my neighbor. And the amazing thing is, and one can see that unless these things are seen, they operate. Because sometimes it's so subtle. Particularly if the image of oneself is strong, that I'm not a prideful person, a proud person, that is a strong image, then subtle pride is just not seen. Because the image is so much more comforting than the reality. So because of all the subtleness of our consciousness, attention is also subtle. someone asked, can I be aware all the time? Let's just look where a question like this comes from. At a moment of awareness where there's no separation from what is there, it's seen, felt, and in that awareness things change, anger may change, disappear. But at a moment of awareness, one doesn't ask this question. It's when the awareness has faded, then comes the question, can I have that all the time? It's thought. Again, operating in time, because all the time is a time concept. In awareness, there's no feeling of time. It's just being there. Not as a concept, but actually. But the mind always wants guarantees. And there are none. Either there's awareness or there isn't. If it's there, it's there. If it's not there, there's inattention with all that inattention brings in its wake or in its sleep. The moment one asks, can I have it all the time, it's already inattention. Do you see that? Asking how can I get attention is just same question as how can I get enlightenment. It's a mental preoccupation and a postponement of looking right now, attending where one is. And it's not so difficult to notice greed when one is eating or serving oneself. It's not so hard to see that. Or to detect envy or ambition or comparison. One comes upon these things when the mind really sees the urgent need to understand itself. That's the first step. And things flow from that once that step is taken. It is as though one really never could completely turn back again. Even though sometimes people say, why in the hell did I ever start this? But human beings are curious. New little children are curious. Genuinely, delightfully curious. And little children already want to be free. They don't want to be imposed upon, even though they're very needy and dependent on their parents or whoever takes care of them. They also want to push them away when they interfere. There are more questions left, but we'll leave those for tomorrow. I think it's enough for today. Where are we right now, if we don't know? We will end here for today.